Hello everyone, it's David. Welcome to today's lesson. Traditionally, if you asked someone whether it was better to rent property or buy it, chances are they would say buy. After all, owning property allows us to increase our net worth, guarantee security for our family, and even earn money through renting it out. But in recent years, housing markets in cities around the world have exploded. With a large number of occupied residential and commercial properties, as well as high price-to-income and price-to-rent ratios, it is becoming harder and harder to own a home. With these runaway prices, is buying still always better? And is it even possible? Today's lesson has two parts. Part 1 focuses on the trend towards renting amid housing inequality in different countries. Part 2 looks at attitudes towards home ownership among different generations in China. Now, let's take a look at the trend towards renting amid housing inequality in different countries. The last decade has witnessed inequality in housing markets around the world. While home ownership used to be an achievable goal for many, the rise in housing prices has now put buying property out of reach for many. In the West, people born between the 80s and 90s are often dubbed the renting generation because they are stuck in renting apartments far longer than their parents. Consider the United Kingdom. In 1980, the average price of a house in the United Kingdom was £20,000, about 3.5 times the average income. It was fairly easy for people to put down a year's salary as a deposit for a mortgage. By 1991, 70% of all Britons owned property, with only 1 in 10 renting it. This is a far cry from the UK's current housing situation, where high prices and rising interest rates have made renting the new normal for millions of young people. According to a study, almost 60% of 20 to 39-year-olds will rent their homes by 2025, while just 26% will be able to buy property. And of that group, most of them have borrowed money from their parents. Not only is housing less affordable, but rents have exploded as well. As of 2017, the average cost of renting a one-room flat in London was £1,133 per month, while nationally the number rose to £945. According to one study, workers under 30 in London spend around 57% of their monthly wages on rent in 2016. But in 2007, they paid around 41%. How did this happen? Part of this has to do with the lack of new houses. In the 1960s and 70s, many people lived in government housing in England. For example, in 1967, the government built 350,000 public housing units, and in 1970, it built 300,000 public housing units. But in the 1980s, the government aimed to reduce spending and encourage home ownership. It began to sell off public housing and reduce the amount of new homes built each year. At the same time, to discourage the urbanization of the countryside, the government made it harder for private developers to build new properties. With strict regulations on housing development, land has become incredibly expensive. The value of existing homes has increased tremendously. And because it is so difficult to approve the construction of a new property, mortgages remain incredibly high. At the same time, the United Kingdom has undergone a massive population boom, with a growth rate faster than at any point since the 1960s. So with huge demand and limited supply, the market is leading to severe inequality. The only people who can afford housing are the very rich and their children. Younger people are especially hurt by this situation on account of student loan debt as well. The average debt for a university graduate in the United Kingdom is £32,220. Paired with rent hikes, young people are spending so much money on debt and survival that they barely have anything to save. The United States housing market has also undergone a dramatic shift since the middle of the 20th century. A lack of affordable housing has caused many Americans to change their outlook on the importance of home ownership. In fact, these days, home ownership rates are down among many Americans, regardless of age. Of all the post-war generations, the most likely to own a home would be baby boomers, who were born between 1946 and 1964. Many boomers grew up at a time when it was easy to buy a home. As a result, many baby boomers own a home. However, U.S. Census figures have revealed that baby boomers are the fastest growing group of renters in the United States, with more than 5 million boomers expected to rent their home by 2020. Part of this has to do with getting older. Home ownership was once regarded as a necessity for raising a family. However, most of the children of baby boomers are now in their late 20s and 30s, which has made owning homes inconvenient and expensive. Many boomers don't want to handle expensive repairs in a house that's too large for them, or pay high property taxes. That's why many are moving to live in smaller rental apartments with more amenities where landlords take care of any problems. Another reason is the changing demographics. While boomers grew up in an era where home ownership was a key to the door of adulthood, young adults struggle to buy property and are avoiding suburban areas in favor of cities. Without enough demand, the property value of suburban houses is diminishing, which has prompted some boomers to cut their losses and sell. Generation X is the next major American generation who prefer to rent a property after baby boomers. They were born mainly between 1965 and 1979 and have also contributed to the decline in home ownership in the United States. Home ownership among this group has dropped the most among any age group since 1993. Generation X are continuing to rent longer than had been expected. Part of this is due to a combination of higher rents and stagnant wages, which makes it difficult to save up enough money to place a down payment on a mortgage. Another reason has to do with the U.S. financial and housing crisis of 2007 to 2010, When the crisis hit, many members of Generation X were in their late 30s and early 40s and had just bought their first house. But as many people lost their jobs, they were forced to give up their homes and go into debt. Of the 19 million people currently renting in America, nearly a quarter of them lost their homes during the housing crisis. So if Gen Xers can afford to buy homes, they may be cautious about making the investment again. Generation Y, also known as millennials, are Americans born between the early 1980s and early 2000s. Millennials are the largest generation since the baby boomers and are often the children of baby boomers. But unlike their parents, millennials have largely forgone buying property. And if they do buy it, they do so much later in life. A common stereotype is that millennials aren't buying property because they aren't interested in it. Certain surveys have suggested that millennials prefer to use their money for experiences like traveling and eating out, and they do seem to prefer an urban lifestyle. Unlike their parents' generation, who were eager to move to the suburbs, millennials are flocking to major cities and staying there. However, there is more to this stereotype than meets the eye. According to a Nielsen survey, millennials still value home ownership and view it as an important priority. Nearly 3/4 of those surveyed viewed home ownership a long-term goal, and 73% saw it as a valuable investment. So why are millennials not buying homes? Just like the United Kingdom, young people in the United States feel financially squeezed. Student loan debt plays a major role in many millennials' postponement of home ownership. The average amount of student loan debt among university graduates in 2016 is $37,142. However, it can range into $40,000 or even $50,000. Additionally, like Generation X, millennials were heavily affected by the crash of 2007. Many millennials had just entered the workforce at the time. The lack of well-paying jobs temporarily set back their earning potential, damaging their ability to save up for a house. As a result, millennials have seen a somewhat extended adolescence and have taken longer to find their footing financially. One offset of this delayed adolescence is that millennials are getting married at a much later age than their parents. From 1960 to 2011, the average age of marriage increased by 6 years. With more millennials postponing marriage into their 30s, postponing home ownership too, since most mortgages are paid with the combined income of husband and wife. Ironically, it seems that baby boomers, the generation most likely to own property, are more comfortable to get rid of it, while the millennials, who are often stereotyped for not wanting property, are the most enthusiastic to have it. In contrast to the UK and the US, China's property market remains heavily in favor of home ownership. According to Xinhua, renting in China only makes up 2% of the property market, compared with 20 to 30% in developed economies. And yet, prices are not lower than in other countries. So why is home owning still such an important priority? Let's look at generational attitudes as well as the housing market in China to understand more. China's post-80s generation has long valued home ownership. To this generation, home ownership, along with car ownership and a good salary, has meant financial stability and social value. However, in China's biggest cities, the price of housing has become exorbitant, making it harder for young people to own homes. For example, in Beijing, the price per square meter for apartments in the city center is around 102,726 yuan. And while Shanghai is slightly less expensive, it isn't much better. The price per square meter for apartments is around 99,139 yuan. According to the statistics website Numbeo, the price-to-income ratio to buy a house in Beijing is 46, while New York City is only around 9. In other words, for the average Beijing employee, it could take more than 40 years' salary to afford even a 90 square meter apartment. As a result, much like the United Kingdom, few young people can manage to purchase a home without financial support from their families. It has led to an inversion of the traditional family structure, where parents end up supporting a single child far into adulthood. Despite the increasing difficulty of owning property, many in the post-80s generation still view it as an essential long-term goal. They strive for good, white-collar jobs and stoically save their earnings to eventually have their own apartment. However, attitudes towards home ownership seem to be changing among China's post-90s generation. According to a survey by the Beijing News, post-90s Chinese are less interested in purchasing property than older generations were at their age. Because they are entering the workforce at a time of global economic recession, as well as an overheated rental market, post-90s Chinese people have had to contend with a different set of financial realities than earlier generations. In general, it is difficult to save money. Consider the Chinese rental market, of which Chinese people aged 20 to 24 years old make up nearly 42%. A single-bedroom apartment in Shanghai's city center costs around 7,103 yuan per month, while an average monthly salary after tax is around 8,976 yuan. Even if someone splits the cost with a roommate, it still means spending almost half their salary on rent. With less income to save, the prospect of buying a home not only seems difficult, but more trouble than it's worth. It's a situation similar to John's from our Dongni course. John was against buying a house at the time because he thought prices were too high. He knew that if he were to buy a house, it would mean taking on a huge debt. Many in the post-90s generation feel the same way. With houses costing half a lifetime's salary, buying a house would mean owing money until their 60s or later. Here's where the post-90s generation may differ in their values from the post-80s generation. Despite the exorbitant price of housing, many in the post-80s generation seem willing to sacrifice to make the long-term investment. One may argue that this is because of their upbringing. Many in the post-80s generation grew up as China was changing, where many goods and services were scarce, and where hard work was seen as the best avenue to success. But this conservatism seems to be more absent among the post-90s generation, who largely grew up in a booming middle class. We could argue that growing up around abundance has created a stronger desire for choice and independence rather than security alone. Consider job statistics among the post-90s generation. Only 40% of post-90s graduates remain in the same job for more than 2 years. It seems as if they prefer personal freedom to financial security. However, while post-90s, like millennials, may be delaying home ownership, that doesn't mean it's not a priority. In fact, across generation, home ownership is still seen as the ultimate prize. And while property values in the country's largest cities may be astoundingly high, many young adults are choosing to rent in large cities while saving money to purchase property in second or third tier cities. Ironically, the trend towards home ownership persists in spite of government efforts to make renting more attractive. In an attempt to cool the housing market, in 2017, the Chinese government launched an experimental program that gave tenants the same access to public services as property owners. For example, the program allows tenants to enroll in neighborhood school districts, a right once reserved for landowners. How successful the program is remains to be seen. The truth is, home ownership is an embedded cultural value within China. A home provides a deep-rooted sense of security, or, as we say in our Dongni course, a place of one's own. Home ownership is often regarded as a prerequisite for marriage. So without a house, it may be incredibly hard to even start a family. Another impetus for home ownership is the household registration or hukou system. In China, household registration is required by law. For families who want to settle down in a city, property ownership is the only meaningful way to get access to good schools and other public services. While this recent government plan will grant greater privileges to tenants without a hukou, the truth is that it will not allow full equality between homeowners and renters. Cities in which the policy has been implemented have seen mixed results. For example, many landlords have discouraged renters to qualify for the program because it would incur taxes. And in Guangzhou, the increased rights for tenants only extended to tenants with a hukou, which seems to defeat the purpose of the measure. The desire for home ownership will likely continue to support housing prices despite the government's best attempts. It seems that we are in a dilemma. On one side, people can't buy homes with the high prices in the housing market. On the other side, many people still need a home for living. So whether we're renting or buying, the choice is not so ideal for most people. What will people do to have a better quality of life? What will the government do to ensure housing equality? Only time will tell. Now let's quickly review what we have discussed today. In today's lesson, we have talked about two things. One, the renting generations in different countries. In this part, we examined the housing history and current housing markets in the UK and the US. And two, attitudes towards home ownerships among different generations in China. From this part, we know that even the post-80s generation holds a different view than that of the post-90s generation. The overall mindset in China concerning home ownership remains consistent. And that's it for today. Thank you guys very much for listening. See you next time.